It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Erin O'Donnell, who is going to formally launch the report by setting out the context of what's happening with our waterways, the definition of waterways, in particular in terms of the thinking around the living entity. I know Dr. O'Donnell is well known to us all, but to recap, she is a senior lecturer, an ARC research fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School. She's a water and policy expert, as the website says, the University of Melbourne website, and recognised internationally for her research into what is relatively new thinking around what is the legal rights for a river. You come from a background in natural science, worked in government, and figured out that law was the way to make a difference. Erin, please.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, bear with me while I attempt to navigate this without my glasses on. Where is the PDF? Nope, not there. Did you leave my slides open, Nicole? Where is Nicole? Aha, there they are. Excellent. So I will begin by saying it's an absolute honour to be here and to launch this really important work that speaks to our understanding of what a waterway is. So as Andrew talked about, I will give a little bit of a context about where I think our relationship with waterways is going, but I will also try not to steal too much thunder from Bruce, who we're going to hear from in a lot more detail about this really important work. It's an absolute delight to see so many people here ready and willing to engage with new thinking on what a waterway is and what law and policy can do to both define it, but also to help shape our relationships with waterways. And as you can see from the title, I think our relationships could do with some repair. We've just had a wonderful welcome, and thank you again to Uncle Tony for that. I will also acknowledge that we're standing here on unceded Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country. Unceded is crucial because it tells us that their laws persist. So this is a place that has multiple legal systems already. So when we think about what a waterway is and the role of law, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is settler colonial law. That's the law that most of us interact with and know. But Indigenous laws persist and remain, and they are operating alongside the laws of the settler state. I will also acknowledge that despite the recent ceasefire, I should use quotation marks around that, we are still in the midst of possibly the world's first live stream genocide. So I stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine, and we remain hopeful, I guess, for a peaceful solution in Gaza that respects their rights to live on their own land. So I talked a little bit about colonial law. Colonial water law, the settler state's water law, constructs water as a resource for capture and use and exploitation. Water and waterways become an object over which humans have dominion. That's the way our legal system currently works. That's what it sets them up to do. That's how it treats those waterways. So in some ways, this imposes an often unspoken requirement of protection, right? Waterways can't look after themselves. So there is then this unspoken obligation to care for them. But it's pretty unspoken, right? Most of our water laws and most of our waterway laws, although they are recognising that there are limits to human behaviour, still largely facilitate the use, domination of those waterways for human benefits. So one of the things that this report asks us to think about is what it would look like to bring ourselves into good relations with water. And I've put back in there because, as Uncle Tony reminded us, and this is something that Uncle Dave Wandon, Wurundjeri Elder, also talks about. We're all Indigenous to somewhere. We all come from a history of having good relations with waterways, relationships built on reciprocity, mutual interdependence and care. So we need to find our way back into that, but it's unfortunately one that most of us here in settler colonial Australia have not yet experienced. So what would it look like to understand waterways as willful, unruly, feeling and acting beings? That's a really profoundly different way of thinking about waterways. So again, not to steal thunder from Bruce, but I think what this report shows is the way that we define waterways for various purposes. Right? In most cases, the way that the settler law has been set up was not necessarily malicious, although I think we can go back and be like, a little bit, what were you thinking? But a lot of it is about saying, how do we make decisions around waterways and how do we apportion responsibility? So the law starts by thinking, well, what is a waterway? How do we define it in the context of how we use it, what protections might apply for it, and who is responsible? And when does that responsibility shift? So our current legal system is framing waterways in the context of their management, thinking about who can do what to them and in what circumstances. So it's quite a functional-oriented definition. It's trying to help us manage waterways, but mainly for our own purposes, right? There's not a lot in there at the moment, with some key exceptions, around the agency of those waterways, the inherent value of those waterways, the fact that waterways exist on multiple scales, and at every scale, waterways remain part of a living cultural landscape. So our current law silos and compartmentalises waterways, artificially breaks down the connection that exists between water and country, between people and waterways, and between waterways of varying sizes. So you've probably all heard Indigenous people in various nations talk about waterways as the veins of country. This is a conversation that I'm having at the moment with Gunditj Mara, so I'll just acknowledge that that's where my most recent inspiration for that idea has come from. Those veins operate at all scales. Something is not less central or important or less worthy of care merely because it is a smaller waterway than a larger one. But that's the sort of system that settler colonial law has created. So one of the ways that we're seeing a response to this is through the recognition of waterways as persons. So this is a global phenomenon. We're seeing a continued acceleration around the globe that is particularly focused on watery beings. Lakes, rivers, wetlands, sometimes other natural objects as well, are becoming formally recognised in law as legal persons or living entities. This transforms waterways. They become far more than a mere resource. They become legal entities with potentially, in some cases, rights and powers of their own. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I think the crucial takeaway here is that we have multiple different legal ways of recognising waterways and affording them rights in law. So at the top here we have legal person. That's not a thing we do in Australia. At the bottom we have living being. That's something that we do here in Australia. The major difference between those two is that a legal person, much like a human person, has the right to go to court, has the right to own property, has the right to enter into and enforce contracts, specific legal powers. A living being occupies a kind of liminal space between object and subject. It doesn't have the right to go to court or to own property or to do any of those legal person things, but it does say, I'm far more than an object over which you have dominion. I'm a living being, I have agency, and we are, as all living beings are, in a relationship. So even though living entity doesn't necessarily come with a lot of legal teeth, it does profoundly challenge our understanding of what a waterway is. Problems remain. Again, the key takeaway from this one is that although this is a global phenomenon to recognise waterways as rights holders and as living persons in those Western or settler legal frameworks, this is not being replicated in our water laws. So oftentimes these legal reforms, these massive transformative legal changes, are being done in almost total isolation from the laws by which we manage water, so who uses it, under what circumstances, and the laws by which we care for waterways and we manage water on a more systemic and holistic level. So we're not seeing that connection be forged. A really great example, of course, is the Birrarung, which is Australia's first and so far only river to be recognised as a single living integrated natural entity. This is the river and its lands. Few caveats. River and its lands sounds pretty great. Lands is defined in the legislation, so this only refers to the gazetted lands. But it is a powerful statement about what a waterway is. It is a living being with whom we are in a relationship. Birrarung is alive, and we are in a relationship with them. And that challenges us, right? Who's had a drink of water this morning? Who's had a cup of tea? Really? Come on. Who's had a cup of tea this morning? Thank you. Birrarung provides 70% of the water that made up that cup of tea. Every single day, every time we have a shower, every time we drink some water, every time we flush a toilet, Birrarung is making our lives possible. Recognising Birrarung as a living being starts to enable us to think about gratitude. What do we owe this river that makes our life possible, and how do we express that gratitude? But it is a river whose legislation, again, exists in large isolation from the Water Act 1989, from the Catchment and Land Protection Act 1994. These things have continued largely unchanged. I can see we've got a few people here from The View. Hi, guys. The View is not a responsible public entity under the Birrarung legislation. So again, we've got this disconnect that continues to play out in law, and it underscores the need for this reform in the way that we know and define what a waterway is. So, to wrap up then, I think my take on this is that colonial law, settler colonial water law, the water laws with which most of us are familiar, has shredded our relationship with rivers and waterways. It separates us from them. It separates us from each other, right? It creates entitlements to water that exist in competition, that require defence against each other. Our relationship, instead of being defined by mutual reciprocity and care, is being defined by exploitation and dominance. That relationship needs repair. So, colonial water law has done some damage. In this report that we are launching today, Bruce and the Concerned Waterways Alliance are laying out a program of reform that can start to address this, that can start to repair these relationships that we have with waterways. And so I think for me, and this is not speaking for anybody but me, I think the three takeaways I would have here: to repair our relationships with water, we have to begin by centring the relationship with Indigenous peoples and local communities and waterways. Because we need to begin with the people who know waterways best. The relationships that we have on a personal and intimate way with waterways should form the foundation for law reform. We need to reform our laws fundamentally to acknowledge waterways as holistic entities, as connected entities. We should stop compartmentalising and breaking them down. We need real law reform, but we also shouldn't be afraid of what looks like mere symbolism. So one of the very first targeted outcomes in Water is Life that came out in 2022 is a commitment to recognise all waterways as living entities in Victoria and traditional owners as a unique voice for those living entities. On the face of it, that sounds like mere symbolism, but that is how you begin. These radical transformations, if you try and do them all at once, generate significant backlash. But what we're after is this relational reform. The lead negotiator in the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Gerard Albert, talks about growing the next 2 generations of people that have a radically transformed relationship with the living river, so that in 2 generations' time we get very different decisions being made. That's the long game that we're playing. And with that, I will wrap up.
Thanks, Erin. That was powerful and fantastic. Thank you. A great launch speech. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Lindsay, the author of the report. Bruce, like Erin, has a rich and varied background of academic studies. He has a Master of Environmental Science as well as a Doctorate of Laws. Doctorate of Laws? Cool, thank you. He is currently on sabbatical from Environmental Justice Australia. He'd be well known to all of us, I think, in his work there. and we commissioned him, the Concerned Waterways Alliance commissioned him to write this report, but I think commissioned is a fairly loose term for what was a very organic and probably long process for Bruce, maybe even tortured. We shall see. He can speak for himself. And I did want to say one other thing is that during his sabbatical, he does have an ambition, and that ambition is to play in Australia's smallest football league, which consists of 3 teams on King Island. So Bruce, take it away, please.
Okay. Good morning. And Ramadan Kareem to all our Muslim brothers and sisters. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the question of the legal concept of waterways. The importance of what at first blush appears to be a narrow technical question lies, in my view, in the fact that in Victorian law, waterway as a concept is a foundational category concerned with how we manage water resources, water ecosystems, and by extension, water as a force in an expression of natural and cultural landscapes. What we mean by waterway may seem self-evident, but it is embedded in legal, historic, scientific, technical and epistemic traditions, which bear on the tasks of water management as well as the relationships to water that are valued. And thank you, Erin, for pointing out the whole question of relationships, which I'll go to in some depth here. But before I go further, let me attend to 2 tasks. First, I want to acknowledge the country of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people on which we meet today, and pay due respects to all Wurundjeri Woiwurrung mob, their elders, and thank you, Uncle Tony, for the welcome to country in particular, and to their ancestral connection and obligations to these lands and waters. Those waters include the Birrarung, as we've already been told, and for which Wurundjeri were instrumental in achieving groundbreaking parliamentary legislation recognising Birrarung as a living entity, as a starting point in debates over waterways, and perhaps a turning point in those debates too. And I'll return, obviously, to the question of rivers as living entities later. Secondly, there is a backstory to this report, Andrew's alluded to it, which may provide some insight into its contents and its propositions. I was asked by the CWA to prepare a brief report on the legal concept of waterway in response to the 2023 decision by the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal in Development Victoria and Knox City Council, so a quite specific VCAT case, a matter in which I had some early involvement. That decision, as discussed in the report, considered the meaning of waterway under the Water Act and the comparable term being used in planning law and Aboriginal heritage law, by the way, including its application to an artificial water body, which was a dam with renaturalised biodiversity values. And it's a case that sits alongside a body of tribunal authority on the meaning of waterway. So this began with a very specific request and intervention. In addition, just in order to keep things interesting for me and for them, the CWA were also interested in the emerging debates around treatment of waters as living entities, or in other words, the emerging application of rights of nature jurisprudence and its implication to the concept of waterway in law and in public policy. Consequently, there are 2 partly connected strands to this document, the result of a sometime evolving and fluid brief, thank you, Andrew, which, to be candid, it did take me some time to work through alongside my day job at the time. And I'm very grateful to the CWA for asking me to take on the challenge of thinking through these issues, and I do so with 2 qualifiers. Obviously, any contribution I make on the issues before us builds on the work of many other thinkers, and Erin among them. Nonetheless, these are my own opinions. On the living entity question in particular, none of what I have to say obviates the fact and the precondition of First Peoples law emanating from lands and waters of which they are authorities. So, the report's really organised into 2 parts. The first part concerns the statutory definition of waterway as a foundational category of the Water Act and ecological considerations in that context. The legal definition of waterway under Victorian law is relatively elaborate. Waterway includes a river, stream or watercourse, quote, natural channel in which water regularly flows, and regularity being a key indicator, a key indicia and of some prominence in the Development Victoria decision. It includes an altered or relocated channel of the above. It includes, quote, a lake, lagoon, swamp or marsh, end quote. Land affected by works on a waterway, as defined above, on which water regularly collects, but not an artificial channel or works diverting water from a waterway. You're lucky I didn't put the whole definition up there. Anyway, I thought we'd better start with the actual definition. Those familiar with legislative drafting, which may not be many people in this room, well done you, may pick up this definition as hallmarks of amendment over time. The Victorian colonial statute, by which public control over water resources originates, contains no overarching concept of waterway, but rather established jurisdiction of the colonial executive, the then colonial executive, in, quote, any river, stream, watercourse, lake, lagoon, swamp or marsh, end of quote. So you can see this is the origin of the current definition. One might assume that the current definition has responded to contingencies over time, such as the effect of works on natural water bodies and other policy developments. And for example, legal treatment of private dams is an interesting example because they are excluded from the definition of waterway expressly. Now, Development Victoria, the case, is notable because it reiterated and confirmed a certain treatment of waterway under Victorian law. A treatment, in my view, broadly consistent with what we call the English inheritance of water resources law in this country. For reasons I'll come to in that treatment, I think that treatment is unduly limited and increasingly strained. Development Victoria concerned the fate of an artificial dam constructed on public land as part of an earlier agricultural training facility. The proponent, which was a statutory body, a state government body, wished to entirely remove that wetland and construct new stormwater works. The pre-existing dam had, as I said, renaturalised, with aquatic native vegetation and biodiversity values, including habitat for threatened species. None of that was in contention in the case. The issues lay in whether the dam was a waterway for the purposes of the Act, and the tribunal held that it was not. The reasons for this decision, unsurprisingly, contain complexity, the tribunal having to work through each indicia of waterway under the Act and also expert evidence on the question. But in my view, they can be reduced to the proposition that a waterway is to be strongly characterised by natural hydrological and geomorphological features, to which certain policy or administrative contingencies, such as those concerning what regularity of flow means, may contribute for purposes of expediency, such as to achieve a degree of legal certainty or stability, which of course the law loves, a certain degree of stability. In referring to prevailing hydrological and geomorphic considerations in the statutory concept of waterway, what I mean is that the defining focus of inquiry is natural flow and or landform. Or in other words, waterway is to be understood by reference to flow of water in the landscape and the landforms that are the product of or to be associated with it, such as channels, floodplains, basins and so forth. This proposition is unremarkable, of course. The question is whether it is sufficient. The equation of waterway with hydrology and geomorphology, or flow and landform, is also broadly consistent with our inherited jurisprudence applying to water, specifically from the English common law, which treats water as a usufruct, which is one of those beautiful legal terms which essentially means an object of utility or something of use, in which rights of control, access, take or use are to be vested, principally for economic benefit, or conversely, water may be an object of disutility or nuisance, such as when we have floods. The model depends heavily on treatment of water as a function of its natural flow and its relationship to landforms. This approach becomes more problematic or strained in certain contexts, such as artificial water bodies, where they exhibit significant ecological or biological values, or highly ephemeral drainage lines or areas of inundation with ecological function. Further, this prevailing hydrological and geomorphic approach effectively overlooks or is insensible to ecological indicia or criteria. That is not to say ecological considerations are absent in Victorian water law. They are plainly evident in various mechanisms under the Act, such as the Environmental Water Reserve or waterway management arrangements, but they are not definitive of the foundational category of a waterway. Among other things, tensions between legal and scientific treatments of waterway may be significant and problematic. Stream or wetland sciences now being fundamentally relying on multidisciplinary models of waterways that include ecological and biological content. There is also tension between the present statutory definition and those employed, for example, under international law. For example, the Ramsar Convention treats wetland, which is the term of art used in the convention, broadly to include artificial structures and relies heavily on ecological considerations for defining criteria of wetland importance. Even Victorian government policy documents appear consistently to take the more expansive approach of assuming benefits in water bodies such as artificial wetlands not captured in the statutory concept of waterway. The corollary of these limitations and tensions, in my view, is the need to consider revision of the statutory concept of waterway under the Act. As a matter of fact, a waterway is ordinarily an ecological entity, as much as it is a hydrological and geomorphic entity. Victorian law might better reflect that reality. Taking some inspiration from the Commonwealth Water Act, my suggestion is an additional indicia or criteria of waterway be added to the Section 3 definition, to the effect that waterway, the concept of waterway, means a water-dependent ecosystem. All other existing content in the definition can remain intact. A slightly more truncated version of the Commonwealth definition could be used, such as a water-dependent ecosystem is, and I quote, a surface water ecosystem or groundwater ecosystem and its natural components and processes that depends on periodic or sustained inundation, waterlogging or significant inputs of water for its ecological integrity. And a reference to a water-dependent ecosystem includes a reference to the biodiversity of the ecosystem. So interestingly, the Commonwealth have done quite a good job in this, and I've always said the Commonwealth Water Act is one of the best environmental laws that we have. Its implementation is another question for another day. The advantage of the approach I propose is that it better aligns law with science, includes but is not constrained to association of waterway with conveyance and phenomena of flow, and provides greater consistency between the statutory concept of waterway and important related terms such as wetland. To the degree any greater precision is required in law, that could be achieved by, for example, mandatory consideration of any scheme of mapped or described water-dependent ecosystems provided for under the Act. And obviously we're quite familiar with mapped and described ecological phenomena in planning and in other areas of law, so I don't think that's a stretch. So that was the first part of the report. Now I turn to the second issue I was requested to comment on, that which we've already had a look at a bit, of waterways as, quote, living entities. The proposition of waterways as living entities seems to me intuitively attractive. Scientifically as well as culturally, rivers, wetlands, springs, oases, seas and oceans are places of great force and great personality. They are subjects of legends, poetry, law, as well as physics and biology and chemistry. They are known and observed, as well as lived with, through, loved and feared. How then to translate this intuition into statute law and the form of reasoning on which that law relies? And now I had to sit on this task for a very long time, not because I had another job to do, but it actually just took a lot of thinking. A podcast on the history of Western philosophy that I was listening to brought me back to undergraduate studies that I did a very long time ago and provided some answers for me. And in particular, I suggest that the task is not only one of legal pluralism, for example, bringing together of Aboriginal law, or as Professor Anne Pauline has described it, first law, bringing that together with statute or settler law. That's what I mean by legal pluralism. But also concurrently cultural pluralism, or a reconciliation of Western philosophical traditions on which, amongst other things, Anglo-Australian legal tradition is based, with the ancient normative foundations of this continent, which I know I'll use the term first law to refer to those. A basis for this reconciliation may be found in notions of land or waters or skies or other phenomenon of the world as active subjects in the world, rather than mere objects or things on which forces such as the law act and from which we may derive a benefit or suffer detriment. And Erin's gone to some of this distinction, I think, with how we treat rivers and waters as objects. Now, we as non-Indigenous persons, we, as I'm saying of me as a non-Indigenous person, are increasingly familiar through the patient education from Indigenous colleagues and leaders and communities with Aboriginal models of law and epistemology, including by which country is invested with rich tapestries of relationships, of forces and beings. Lands and waters in those traditions are and always have been active and powerful subjects, not only being the natural world, but making the natural and the cultural world. And I take the current concept of rivers and waterways as living entities to be informed by that cultural model. Now, for example, in the Echuca Declaration, Mildren delegates wrote in 2007, the Murray and Lower Darling Rivers Indigenous Nations, they wrote in 2007, and I'll quote here, quote, "Further recognising and affirming that water has a right to be recognised as an ecological entity, a being and a spirit, and must be treated accordingly. For the Indigenous nations, water is essential to creation, and many of dreaming and other ancestral beings are created by and dwell within water. Water is a living being and should be treated accordingly. Many of our ancestral beings are created by and live in water," end of quote. In her report, Nourishing Terrains, Deborah Bird Rose, a great anthropologist, famously wrote, and I quote, "Country is, in Aboriginal English, is not only a common noun, but it's also a proper noun. People talk about country in the same way that they would talk about a person. They speak to country, sing to country, visit country, they worry about country, they feel sorry for country, and they long for country. People say that country knows, hears, smells, takes notice, takes care, is sorry or is happy. Country is not a generalised and undifferentiated type of place, such as one might indicate with terms like spending a day in the country or going up the country. Rather, country is a living entity with a yesterday, a today and tomorrow, with a consciousness and a will towards life," end of quote. Now, as I understand it, first law concerning waterways and country more generally is abundant with powerful spiritual and metaphysical actors, with ancestral beings and law attached thereto. Manifest not only in natural properties and forces, rivers and waterways may bear qualities of the natural, supernatural and the human, woven together as subjects or associated with beings in themselves. Waterways are therefore vested with ontological character. The waterway itself as being or as possessing attributes of a distinct being. The status of waterways as living entities in law and policy owes much to Indigenous law practice and struggles for self-determination globally. And Erin has indicated this already. The outcome is now evident in those legal schemes and decisions creating rivers as legal persons, or in other words, as legal subjects, such as in the Te Awa or the Wanganui Settlement Act in New Zealand, the Rio Trata decision in Colombia, and even the Yarra Birrarung Act here in Victoria. The rights of nature or earth jurisprudence movement has also been instrumental in building this space in which nature is treated as a legal subject rather than a mere object of appropriation, use, damage, or of aesthetic enjoyment. Now, the New Zealand academics James Morris and Jacinta Ruru presciently speculated more than a decade ago on the use of legal personhood to govern rivers in New Zealand, in a way reconciling statute law and Maori ontology. And I quote from them, is legal personality a vehicle for recognising Maori relationships to water? The beauty of the concept is that it takes a Western legal precedent, legal personhood, and gives life to a river that better aligns with a Maori worldview that has always regarded rivers as containing their own distinct life forces. Furthermore, the legal personality concept recognises the holistic nature of a river and may signal a move away from the Western legal notion of fragmenting a river on the basis of its bed, flowing water and its banks. End of quote. What may be the philosophical or the jurisprudential basis for treating waterways as living entities in the Western tradition? That is, what usefully can non-Indigenous and in particular European intellectual traditions bring to the task of understanding waterways, or indeed nature more generally, as subjects, as whole living forces, not just as fragmentary or utilitarian resources? The law is heavily informed by those traditions, those Western intellectual traditions. While in this tradition we employ science to evidence the properties and the forms and the behaviours of nature, from microorganisms, for example, to the whole planetary ecosystem, and also including waterways, it's the philosophical tradition that has interrogated what we mean by being and what we mean by subjectivity. In that tradition, we ascribe to subjects, and this is important, some form of will or directing and conscious living force. What I am suggesting is that we are extending that insight to living entities in nature, by which natural entities are not mere things or objects in the landscape, but expressions of an animate force or forces. In practice, we have seen this translated into legal form through the device and the metaphor of personality, or as Erin's indicated already, legal personhood. A device well known to the law, and one by which law may recognise the, quote, directing mind and will of actors other than individual persons, including via human agents. So the law is familiar with there being an entity that's not an individual person, that is a directing force, a directing mind and will of that entity. In this context, we should remember that a role and a function of law is to govern or regulate conduct, which also relates to what Erin was saying about relationships, governs relationships, including conduct between persons, institutions and human agents. If a river or waterway is itself recognised as a living entity or its own being, a natural phenomenon imputed with its own will and a force, a function of the law is to measure and set out conduct and relationships to that entity. This approach, I think, has implications for legal principles of governance of waterways and, by extension, design of laws, including the meaning of waterway itself. First, by the interaction of first law and settler law with their differing traditions and origins, waterway as a living entity is a question of legal pluralism. Both sources of law are involved in defining a waterway as a living entity, and therefore protocols and arrangements for doing so are required, for sorting that arrangement out. Legally and institutionally, it seems to me a waterway as a living entity is inherently bicultural and also must be a device of decolonising practice. Second, legal treatment of waterways as living entities must acknowledge relationships and conducts toward those entities to date, that is historically and contemporaneously, specifically as evident in first the colonial tradition, by which Aboriginal people's ancient connection to waterways was the subject of policies of annihilation, and also in the usufructuary relationship, by which conduct and practice toward waterways rests on exploitation and use. So we need to acknowledge the history and the current practice. Third, and Erin's usefully gone to this, including in the article she refers to, the countervailing approach is conduct toward living entities that is mutual or reciprocal, as between human and nature. It is conduct that is nourishing, restorative, and it is beyond utilitarian. Fourth, if waterways are living entities, it seems apt and necessary to me to ensure they are invested with rights to exist as such, or protection or recovery, to protection and recovery of their ecological and cultural qualities, and to defining relationships between that waterway and others. Other persons, including government and the users of waterways, ought at the same time to be invested with corresponding obligations not to abrogate these basic rights and qualities. Fifth, general standards of governance, as may be reflected in those general rights, for example, of a waterway to exist and have basic protections and recovery. Or even we might have a charter for waterways as a general set of standards. These may be supplemented by specific and more detailed schemes for specific waterways. That could be, for example, by a treaty for a particular waterway. You could even have a treaty with a particular waterway. It could be by personhood, legal personhood as a mechanism, or it could be by other legal or institutional procedures for specific waterways. And actually in the report I do go to some specific ideas about reform proposals and descriptions of waterways and how they might be integrated into the Act. And sixthly, and to circle back to the question, the basic question that I was asked to deal with is the legal definition of waterway. Reform may be as simple as including in the definition of that quote, waterway means a living entity as provided for in accordance with this Act. So by that way, an end of quote, you would integrate the concept of living entity as an element of the definition and hardwire it into the definition of the Act itself. The specific scheme by which a law gives effect to living entity status being contained elsewhere in the Act. So this approach creates a link between the foundational concept of waterway in the Act and how living entity status may be operationalised through the law. And as a matter of operationalising a waterway as a living entity, the statutory scheme should require, for example, description or expression of a waterway as a living entity, including the Act should set out the procedure for doing that. In some ways, the ARA strategic plan is of this nature. Another example is the bringing together of social and cultural assessments of waterways in the Murray-Darling Basin. And another example that I quite like, and some people may have read this, is there's a paper that was prepared by the Waterways River of Life and others, including Professor Polina, on the term they use, the adventure into the mighty river country of the Waterways, which is the Fitzroy River in the Kimberley region of WA. That document sets out what that river is as a living entity, in a written, documented form. And so there's many other ways in which this could be done, this description or documentation of a river as a living entity. Indeed, in the paper I indicate that documentation or writing things down need not necessarily be the only way to do this. I mean, traditionally, law in Aboriginal custom and tradition is sung, it's danced, it's drawn, it's painted. Why should we be confined merely to the written form? So in the Act, legal obligations attaching to any statement or expression of a waterway as a living entity will be important. Our law tends to rely, especially environmental statutes, on obligations. I suggest stronger statutory obligations rather than weaker ones should be built into the law, such as requirements to, for example, give effect to or not act inconsistently with such statements of what a living entity is, rather than mere regard to or consideration of them. The lawyers in the room will understand the distinction and its significance. So in conclusion, these are my attempts at a pragmatic response to the brief. As to why we should urge the law to take a different course, that in my view is because it should better reflect the human relationships to these places. And on that note, I will leave you with the words of the American poet Mary Oliver, a poet of our relationships to nature, which I think reflects the why. And this poem has a bit of a dialogue in it, and I'll try and capture it. From this river, when I was a child, I used to drink. But when I came back, I found that the body of the river was dying. Did it speak? Yes, it sang out the songs, the old songs, but faintly. What will you do? I will grieve, of course, but that's nothing. What precisely will you grieve for? For the river, for myself, my lost joyfulness, for the children who will not know what a river can be, a friend, a companion, a hint of heaven. Isn't that somewhat overplayed? I said. It can be a friend, a companion, a hint of heaven. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. That was fantastic. We're now going to have question and answer, so if you could make the way to these two wonderful chairs, Bruce and Erin. Thank you. I did want to just take this opportunity to acknowledge wherever we were for first bringing into Victorian policy thinking the living entity concept, which they had to do through strong advocacy. So I think it's well worth making that note and respecting them for that incredible work. And also just noting the City of Yarra, because the City of Yarra was really where the living entity began to creep into planning law through the planning control were first done in the City of Yarra, and they were expanded and grown into the Yarra planning controls that we have today. So, are we all sorted?
I think we are.
Well, I'll hand over to you guys. Well, really, in a sense, handing over to you guys. I mean, what questions do you have for Bruce and Erin? And we've got two microphones.
Have we answered them all?
Sorry, what was that?
Have we already answered them all? No.
Is anybody willing to listen there? Please.
I just thank you both, it was fantastic. I suppose Jude and I have come down from Melbourne territory, and we've just had the decommissioning of the ball fields there. So I was just interested in thinking through the role of it, or aquifer and groundwater, and I suppose there's no separation between surface water and groundwater, but, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know where that all sits, but I was just wondering if you wanted to have a comment on that.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yep.
Interestingly, until the 1989 Water Act, there was a separation in law between groundwater and surface water. There was a separate Groundwater Act once upon a time, but that's just my nerdy lawyering. Obviously, in practice, there isn't really a distinction between surface water and groundwater, and I think that to the extent that any of the reforms proposed here or the thinking proposed here is taken up in some statutory form, I mean, we're dealing with groundwater systems and interactive surface water groundwater systems, regardless. So I think the point I make about ecosystems, you can have groundwater ecosystems, obviously, that would be reflected in the concept of waterway, I think. The other comment I'd just make about groundwater systems in particular is that there is clearly instances where groundwater ecosystems are of both profound practical scientific value, but more importantly, of profound cultural value. We see this, I think there's one of the more spectacular and somewhat catastrophic examples at the moment in Queensland with the Darney, for example, and the impact of mining on groundwater, sacred groundwater systems up there. So I think the attachment of first law and sacredness to groundwater systems is usually pretty self-evident. And I know his colleagues here in the west of Melbourne, for example, have done a lot of work about groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and so they're quite near to us here too, yeah.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that groundwater is often the poor cousin, right? Like it's an invisible system, and so people tend to overlook it. But I think that makes it even more important for us to think about what our relationship is with these aquifers that underpins so much that matters. So whether it's springs, whether it's the low flows during summer that aquifers are maintaining in river systems, acknowledging these connections, but also just acknowledging the role of groundwater in the ground. And this is something that First Law speaks to specifically. So Aboriginal nations can articulate the value of that water remaining there. That's its job, to stay there in the ground. And we can still have a relationship with that groundwater system, with that aquifer. So I think telling more stories, raising the profile of groundwater, highlighting our connection to it, and it's a genuinely special thing. There's often incredibly diverse endemic groundwater species that occur in one aquifer and nowhere else. So yeah, celebrating that, telling those stories, continuing to raise the profile of it is really important.
So I would just add a couple of things. First of all, the decommissioning of the bore field at Anglesey, and there's other, CMA colleagues and so forth, and Water Authority colleagues might know better than me. I think it's the only instance I've ever heard of decommissioning of water infrastructure in Victoria. So it's quite an extraordinary outcome in itself, I just wanted to point out. The other thing I'll just briefly note, this is just being a legal nerd, a lot of the leading water cases in Victoria, water litigation, in VCAT actually involve groundwater. Back in the Millennium Drought, there was a series of VCAT cases that are still leading cases to this day on water law that arose out of disputes over groundwater extraction.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you. Could I just follow on with one question? How do you define the boundaries of the entity? How do you say that the Yarra ends here in terms of the way we're talking about it in law, given that the Yarra River lands define it in the Burrowing Act? Any thoughts, any comments? It's something that bugs me.
You can have a crack at that one.
My favourite definition of what a waterway is and how we set boundaries around it comes from Te Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River legislation. And Section 12 says, the Wanganui River is a living and indivisible whole from the mountains to the sea, including all its physical and metaphysical elements. And so that is in the statute, that is the legal language that defines the nature of that river. And what I love about it is that it's all-encompassing. It's from the mountains to the sea. It's a catchment scale definition. It's living and indivisible, so it's talking about that holistic understanding of the waterway. Physical elements, yes. Metaphysical is the relationships between people and the river. That is a really crucial word that Wanganui iwi have been litigating about for over 150 years. They wanted their relationship with the river acknowledged in law. And so, as a definition, it's relatively easy to understand and apply. It's the river from the mountains to the sea. It's the physical connection, it's the catchment of that river. So for settler thinkers, for scientists, for policymakers, we can understand that definition. But it also brings in the human relationships very specifically and explicitly. And so, yeah, that's my favourite way of thinking about how we set a boundary.
And I think just for the benefit of those working in water authorities and CMAs and government and so forth, I think at the level of principle, you can do it, there's statutory basis on which these kind of definitions occur at a high principled level. So obviously science has a key role to play in defining those kind of boundaries. And also at a much more practical regulatory operational level, frequently they're mapped or described. So it probably happens in layers, really. It can happen across different traditions, but it can happen at level of a high level or at a much more detailed level, I think. Yep.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on what challenges there might be to enacting some of these reforms that you see in the government and policymakers in industry. Is it how much of it is ignorance, how much of it is this corporate interests and other elements? What do you think are those major reforms challenges?
Well, obviously there's always a fair degree of inertia in government and in industry. There's existing rights and relationships and investment in the status quo. So inertia is always an issue. But I think that it's typically a stepwise process. So I think, and Erin did allude to this, the shift in thinking takes a period of time, and it's kind of fascinating the degree to which there has been a shift in thinking over the last decade. I mean, I started dealing with water law probably about 2014, and the notion of earth jurisprudence and rights in rivers seemed, as I once said to someone, a bit batshit crazy. But look where it is now, right? So there has to be an intellectual and jurisprudential shift of thinking. Like, you can't, it's a cultural shift, right? Because politicians will kind of go with the flow in many respects too. And let's not understate politics in this. Obviously, there's a lot of vested interests in water. Shifting some substantial reform like this is not easy. What I sought to do in drafting the contents in the way I had is to try and do so in a way that balances between somewhat pragmatic and somewhat radical. I mean, that's typically the approach that I've always taken in work anyway, as an environmental lawyer and having worked in policy areas. You have to do things that I think existing institutions can identify with, and then just push it further and push it harder. So also, in terms of being a lawyer, the law likes things that are tangible and a fair degree of certainty and stability. So you kind of do have to deal with the level of legal principle, high-level conceptual things. You also have to deal with what it's going to look like in practice. And it's difficult to do that in great detail in a report of this size, obviously, and this is really a thought-provoking intervention as much as anything else. But I did say, yes, let's deal with a level of principle, including in the definition of the Act. If you're going to reform the definition, you could do it in this particular way, or this kind of drafting, which is probably reasonably radical in some ways, or maybe not. But then you do need to figure out a much more detailed scheme, and that's what I allude to and said, like, you need to also, it will need a more detailed regulatory or statutory scheme to make it work, so that you're not going to freak everyone out too much. All right, but the idea is to get the thinking started. Not only the conceptual thinking, but how it will work in a statutory scheme. And I'd be delighted to hear from those working in water authorities and in government, and I've had some kind of conversations briefly already, but what your views are about how this would work, or whether it simply won't work, or whether there's some halfway house to make it work as well.
Thanks, Andrew. John from Verity. Just asking, the recent release of the planning laws to the 18 creeks and waterways across Melbourne was a sign of success of former advocacy around Melbourne in particular, and down into Geelong, of course. What hope have we got for that sort of stuff to be pushed out into the rest of Victoria and further, perhaps? I mean, in line with all this mood that's going on around the world with different things, as Erin explained earlier also.
Yeah, no, I'll have a go.
I think for me the takeaway with this stuff is that, and it's the same with, say, the Wanganui River, that a lot of the impact of these new kind of ways of regulating our relationship with rivers happens at the planning and development level. So one of the ways of understanding this new way of thinking about rivers is to think about it as a value proposition that then gets embedded in planning and development processes, in planning schemes and in other places, because that's how it actually starts to change the way that decision makers weigh up development or other actions that are affecting rivers. But it does so in a way that changes the decision-making space, but doesn't necessarily, sometimes it can, but doesn't always preclude specific actions. Some of these planning reforms are quite specific in terms of heights and setbacks from rivers, and that's like where we can be specific, we should, but I think we shouldn't be afraid of doing things which are a little bit less specific. So the living entity idea, to pick up on what Bruce is saying, law regulates human relationships with each other and with rivers. So the living entity is a way of saying, what is our relationship currently? What would we like it to be in the future? And how do we start to move towards that? So what I really like about it as a concept is that it sets in train a really long-term shift. It starts to find its way into those planning and development decision-making frameworks, but it doesn't immediately alter people's rights and interests in rivers as they exist right now. So it is actually an invitation to the wider community to go on a journey of saying, what kind of relationship do we want with rivers and how do we want to regulate that in our planning frameworks? In terms of the specifics of seeing that push out into the rest of Victoria, I feel like that's probably a question for the Victorian government, but let's trumpet the success where we can and hopefully they'll continue to be inspired.
So I'll just say, obviously with regard to planning law largely, in terms of the ecological question or the ecological content of Waterway as a concept, a lot of that already functions effectively in planning law now through overlays or, VPPs, things like this. So obviously this paper goes to the concept of Waterway as a legal concept. And as I said, there are many ways in which, at least in terms of recognising waterways as ecological entities, that is already reflected in many ways in water management law and in planning law now. So in terms of the ecological content or character proposition, this is about shifting it into kind of, as I said, foundational concepts in the Act and to make it more wide-ranging. That's the first part of the report, obviously. Erin is obviously alluding to the living entity question, which is perhaps, John, the more interesting proposition you're trying to raise here is how does planning law then deal with the question of living entities, or what is a living entity? I mean, curiously, of course, the Yarra Act is essentially a planning act, I might say, and it already includes the concept. And obviously people have done a lot of work trying to thrash out what that means in a practical or pragmatic sense in the Yarra, with a lot of kind of statutory confinement, I might say, geographic confinement. One institution or one set of institutions that has not dealt with this question yet, and this is where I reckon it'll get fascinating, is the courts and tribunals. I'd love to see a judge deal with this question. I don't know if it's occurred in New Zealand, has it? Have they dealt with some of these questions? In New Zealand, I think the jurisprudence, because it's Maori law, is much more embedded in legal practice and thinking. They've dealt with a lot of this stuff more fully than here, and there may well be some interesting jurisprudence to come out of countries like New Zealand to inform what happens here. But I reckon that will be a pretty fascinating exercise if and when it happens. And it happens in VCAP before it happens in the courts too, I might add.
I've got the next question. Tracy from Friends of Latrobe, Latrobe Valley, and we might have some good cases there with the mining and what's going on there and nuclear. Now, it's really interesting that I think consultants are ones that are really left out of this big picture, because when they were looking at the allocations for water entitlement to fill the pits, and the consultants' report said the Latrobe River system, which is a regulatory cap system, said the river benefited from water that which it was not entitled to. So, look, you don't think we hit the because we're a community, we can say whatever we want. That's the beauty of us in community. And we were challenging all the government departments. And it's just this whole concept of, there is this exploitation and there's this right to take, and the river had no rights. This is a major consultancy firm. We were really disappointed about. And again, when government are actually commissioning these reports, it's terms of reference. So it's not actually taking all these other considerations in, So that's intriguing about how the consultants are looking at things now.
So I'll answer that wearing a slightly different hat. So one of the roles that I have is as a member of the Bureau and Council. And so I'm not here today in that capacity, but just to share some of the that is emerging for us as a really important sphere of influence, is how do you take these high-level concepts like Birrarung is a living entity and embed them in the operational levels of local governments and government agencies who are issuing those kinds of terms of reference, and then influence the people who are operationalising that, people who are doing the work. And so that's where I think continued conversations about, if the river is a living entity, what is your relationship? How do we make this work? What does it mean? How do we do things differently to acknowledge that reality? We've got to keep pushing that down a level. So one of the functions of the Birrarung Act is enabled through the Yarra Collaboration Committee, for instance, which enables all of the responsible public entities to talk about, well, how are we operationalising this concept? There's planning development happening right now to think about how do we embed it within a planning practice note, for instance, or something that enables an easier access point, I think, for people. But this is it's a real challenge to keep trying to change those mindsets. But I think the way through that is to keep talking about it, to keep seeing it as non-negotiable, and to keep raising the expectation that people will do better.
I think I'd also add that the example of the valley, and obviously the rivers in the Latrobe Valley are intimately connected to the Gippsland Lakes. You know, it's a catchment as a whole. The intriguing thing about that whole landscape in some ways is that it is massively changed and massively damaged already, right? So if you were going to, I guess this paper is just about the legal concept of waterway and expanding it. And whether that's a vehicle or has some utility in dealing with the fate of those waterways and their connections is a bit of an open question. But I think to the extent that the idea of a living entity becomes part of the statutory scheme of water law or water management, then in a context like that, I think it really does raise some questions about whether you are maintaining the existence of a waterway as such. Like, there's a point at which waterways are destroyed. Like, do they existentially disappear? I mean, obviously that happens for groundwater dependent systems, for example, as well. It's a real question as to determine then what rights and obligations attach to the mere existence of those kind of waterways and also their recovery. Because I think it's one of the big legal and policy questions that environmental law more generally, but certainly water law, really struggles with, is not only how you protect things, but what is recovery, what does restoration mean? And what does recovery mean? And I think it's a really underdone question, and I think it's a really fundamental question if you're going to identify waterways as living entities, is where you have to kind of assume in some ways they are, if they're beings in their own right, then they have some kind of existence that you can describe or know, but it would change and flux over time. And who's to determine and define what the end point is? I mean, I've been doing a lot of work around the Gippsland Lakes, and this is a very fascinating question in the Gippsland Lakes because it is so fundamentally different from what it was before European settlement. But the valley's exactly the same, possibly even more damaged because of those mines. What is a waterway in the context of a giant hole in the ground that is getting decommissioned?
Angela?
Hi there. Sorry, I'm just going to change tack. One of the critiques I have, it's Angela here from the Narrabeen River area. One of the critiques I read was around the notion of personhood and the complexity of that in the fact that if you give a personhood in a legal sense, it can be sued for flooding or doing damage or something like that. It might have been something that either of you wrote at some point, but I wondered, if you had something to say about that and why this going down the living entity road might be a kind of different way forward.
Can I just make a quick comment and hand it to you?
Yeah.
I'll just make a quick comment about that because I think Erin has written to it and she can talk to it much more length than me. You can, by law, simply create immunities, right, from liability. So if you have a natural entity as a legal person and with a representative or an agent like a guardian or representative council or corporate body or whatever the case may be, yes, it can be liable for certain damages, and you have civil liabilities for damages from unreasonable flow of water now, I might add, by any other person who's a landowner, for example. But you can neutralise that by simply creating immunities from, the natural way in which a river functions, for example.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that comes up every time we talk about legal personhood because it is so defined by that adversarial nature of being able to go to court to protect your rights. So I think Bruce is right, like any kind of statutory scheme should be thinking about what kind of immunities do we want to create in it. I think from a really practical level, right, if we think about suing a river, what are the assets that you are suing? Like, what do you hope to gain access to as a result of that? So I think there would be some very significant legal practicalities that would, I think, act as a disincentive. But what my work shows is more than those kind of practicalities, it actually shows that personhood can tip our relationship into a space which is less helpful. So for me, the fundamental question when you're thinking about what kind of legal entity should we be creating for a specific waterway is what kinds of powers do you actually need to have? There are places in the world, like for instance the United States. Ecuador's been a wonderful place where we see rights of nature turning up in courts and being upheld. Do you need to go to court? Like, is that your primary driver? Because if it is, you need legal personhood. If you need to get in there, if you need to be acting as an independent entity, then yeah, by all means look into that. But I think in most cases we actually don't. In most cases we're talking about what kind of relationship shift are we wanting to see here and who does that relationship shift have to happen? In Australia, it's mostly policymakers. So it's mostly people, like most of the people in this room, who are thinking about how do you make decisions about the way that you impact on waterways and what is the framework for making those decisions. And so living entity offers a way to challenge the existing resource exploitation framework within the environmental limits that the law currently provides and says, what would it look like if we made a decision based on our relationship with the river? What kind of relationship do we want to create here? Where is reciprocity embedded in this relationship? So for instance, in the Birrarung legislation, you can see reciprocity in the Yarra River protection principles. You can see it in the idea of the net gain for the river. And the living entity invites us into that conversation. So I think it is, we see less backlash when legal personhood is off the table because it astonishes me how quickly that question comes up. And it's not usually framed in the way that you framed it. It's usually, can we sue the river when it floods us? And it doesn't seem to matter who I'm talking to. It could be a group of, of concerned waterway people like we've got here today. And it's an immediate go-to. So for me, that highlights the danger of the legal personhood if we go into it without a clear sense of why we need it. Living entity, much less powerful. So legally, it does lack teeth, but it's it is that radical opportunity to do things differently and to take a longer term journey to a new way of being with waterways. And I think that's the compelling argument for it, is to say this is a long-term change and we will work on it together. It's a very inclusive reform that says everybody has already, we all have a relationship with our waterways right now. Some of that relationships are not great. I was having a conversation with some senior executives at Melbourne Water, and one of them says, look, in my job, the river is a threat. That's how I relate to it. Because their work focused on flood risk mitigation. But once we articulate what our relationship with the river is now, then we can say, well, you know, what makes it a threat? How do we change the parameters that enable you to see the river as a threat? Is the river the threat, or is it the fact that we've actually enabled people to live on floodplains in ways that pose risk to them when the river is just acting as a river, being dynamic and flexible over time? So for me, that's the power of living entity. It's hard because that's very difficult to put into a brief to a minister, right? Like, we're going on a journey together, minister, don't worry about it, we'll get there in the end. Where are we getting to? We don't really know, but it'll be better than where we are. But that's how you get transformative change, is to embark on a journey that is gentle, that doesn't take away from people right now, and that enables all of us to create the future that we want.
So I'll just quickly add, in terms of ministers, I do remember having a photo with Lisa Neville on the Maribyrnong. Just to reiterate the point Erin's saying, I think to the extent that building in concepts like living entity, or even more genuine strengthened ecological considerations in waterway concepts, to the extent that's generating normative change, which presumably what we're trying to do here, then it assists, I would think it assists planners and regulators on the ground not to do things like putting houses in floodplains. Because if you say a river is a living entity with its certain forces and cycles and so forth, you assume, and you would have knowledge by science or other means of what the flooding regimes are, for example. So the Maribyrnong being an interesting example, there's a whole lot of houses that never should have been put where they've been put. Probably the racecourse shouldn't have been put where it's been put, but if you take away the wall, it's a useful floodplain. It's surely the racecourse. So I think that, and I remember writing some submissions to the Arab panel hearing around the ordinary natural cycles of flow, of flooding and drought and flooding that would apply to the Yarra, right, is partly what you're trying to reinstate and re-achieve, because there's a whole lot of stranded wetlands on the middle and upper Yarra that don't receive water but should, because the natural living character of that river would naturally flood them, right? So to the extent that the living entity proposition changes the normative foundations by which those doing the everyday practical work of dealing with planning and rivers and land use and so forth adopt and have to deal with the proposition. In terms of a specific waterway, that may be a very detailed description and proposition. It will help them avoid liability, I would imagine, in the long run. It's a quite useful strategic planning mechanism.
Thanks, Bruce and Erin. I'm from People for a Living Warrable, and at the moment we're going through a process with Southern Water and the Maribyrnong and other agencies around farm dams on waterways. One of the big things that got us involved was to have a Southern Water officer explain that he could be standing on a side of a watercourse with a Corangamite catchment management officer, and both would have a different opinion on whether that was a waterway in front of them. So that definition of a waterway, obviously, there's a lot of discussion around being a grey box in many regards. But we've got headwater streams, and Bruce, in your paper you talk about the 60-hectare rule. And some of these headwater streams, obviously in clear catchments, might have a lot of ecological things going for them, but they obviously are part of that living entity. I'm just wondering, do you feel that we're able to reach out and encompass those headwater streams through that living entity concept, and whether that will then step down into how ministerial directions are formed around definitions of waterways?
This is a Dorothy Dixer, I might add, from Cameron, I think. I think it's actually more genuinely or more effectively probably dealt with the first part of what I've suggested, is having a definition of an ecological definition attached to waterways. Because, and really the problem, the issue that Cameron's raising is where you have highly ephemeral drainage lines or watercourses that are part of the wider catchment and system of waterways, but are, because they don't routinely or regularly flood or are not regularly inundated, will not be considered as waterways, especially, well, where there's no obvious landform. And there's other types of water-dependent ecosystems that are in this boat, like those who are ecologists in the room will know of things like seasonal herbaceous wetlands, which are very intermittently flooded, but when they do, they're quite important ecosystems. And Victoria, partly as a product of historic drainage schemes, has lost a lot of different types of very ephemeral, seasonal, water-dependent ecosystems. I think there is a real question around whether many of these would be considered waterways under the Act. And often it has to do with this question of what is the regular flow of water, which in the Development Victoria case was a quite important defining proposition. My view, which is in the document, is I think we should just step away from some of the technicalities and accept that waterways should have an ecological content to it, an ecological basis to it. And if it assists in certainty and stability, then add to that much more detailed mapped or described mapping or descriptions of those waterways on the ground. I mean, you know, everyone loves a map, and there's plenty of GIS people who can do it. So as Cameron once said to me, drawing blue lines on maps is easy, it's straightforward, it probably covers a lot of the problem. But it also, I think it needs to be supported foundationally by just a clear, obvious ecological basis to what a waterway is. Because I think, as the proposition that I point out, I think it's a major gap and limitation in the law at the moment.
Thank you. David from Friends of Gippsland.
Well, David, can I just, Erin, I know you have to go.
It's all right.
40,
I'll hang in there.
Just being
Yep.
respectful of your
Thank you, I appreciate
time.
that.
Sorry, David, please go.
Thank you. Just in relation to the living entity concept and having an ecological aspect to a waterway, if I could just bring us to the Victorian Marine and Coastal Act 2018 and policy. It sort of very broadly defines the marine and coastal environment to allow for biodiversity associated with the land and water, as well as a very general concept of just any water, sort of incredibly broadly defined. And we've been trying to use the marine and coastal policy and act to protect Ramsar wetlands and the Gippsland lakes from inappropriate coastal developments, for instance. And the symbolism of that act and the principles, such as integrated coastal zone planning, ecosystem-based management, appeal to a lot of those points that you both described to in your talks. And the symbolism is really powerful. But what we're finding is it doesn't really translate very well to changes in on-the-ground strategic planning. They're still seeking to push through and approve multiple coastal subdivisions right up onto the what will be the future shoreline when we consider sea level rise and so forth. But we've got this very static planning policy that doesn't see the future. It doesn't consider the future shoreline is actually rapidly approaching. And rather than seeing wetlands as the living shoreline defence, which is part of the marine and coastal policy, we should be giving room for these wetlands to retreat as sea levels rise, and that will help shock absorb and buffer us from the destructive impacts of coastal hazard risks. There's this real disjunction. So what we're seeing is they're putting constructed wetlands in the floodplain, which inhibits, acts as coastal squeeze, it inhibits wetland migration. So we've sold on this concept that these constructed wetlands will help reduce pollutants into Ramsar wetlands, but at the same time, you're taking away their future right to exist, because they'll have nowhere to go. So very long-winded, but my question is, even when we have these symbolic wins, and I think the Marine and Coastal Act and Policy are very progressive, very forward-thinking, they're still not translating to actually protect these living entities today. So what advice do you have for us to try and see these great legal rules and laws actually applied?
Welcome to my day job. As I often used to cite to people, as T.S. Eliot once said, between the conception and the reality falls the shadow, which is really, there's the law and there is its implementation. I guess partly the value, if not the genius, of trying to deal with, use the concepts like living entity, is to shift the normative foundations of all of it. All right? That's one of and Erin's talked to this obviously quite a lot. Like, in part, you need to shift the culture and the thinking so that it is kind of embedded in practice, public practice, not only of regulators and government, but, industry and the general public as well. In that respect, it is a long arc and a long-term change. As to whether and how embedding living entity, the concept of a living entity in law, in a definition or in other ways, like if in some respects in Ramsar planning mechanisms for the Gippsland Lakes, if you were to embed it in that kind of context. Again, I think a lot of how that would play out in practice on the ground has to do with what obligations you attach to having to work with that concept. I've always been a vociferous supporter of much stronger obligations than not, because as soon as you have obligations merely to have regard to, for example, the Gippsland Lakes as a living entity, or if it was the Barwon River as a living entity or whatever, of course, having regard to is a very weak obligation. If you have much stronger obligations, then for us as litigators, you have something on which to sue and have a court deal with it. That's one thing. But a lot of this works in the shadow of the law, right? Like, a regulator will look at this and say, we have to not act inconsistently with this concept, or we have to give effect to this concept in our planning and our operations and so forth. I reckon that would be a pretty fascinating exercise in simply requiring planners and regulators on the ground figure out what it is and how it's going to work too. Right? There's challenges to this, but I suspect there's also immense opportunities. I mean, if you look at the Yarra context, to be honest, I had a lot of ambivalence about the Yarra Act when it was actually being implemented, because there was strengths and weaknesses in the whole thing. But not for a moment did I not think there's immense opportunity here in some pretty out-of-the-box thinking. And Erin and others in this room have dealt with it in practice a lot more than I have since the Act came into force. But I think if you embed in law and in public policy these kind of concepts, and then as planners on the ground in East Gippsland Shire or the East Gippsland CMA or whoever it is have to confront them, they have to take them on board, they have to figure out how to implement them, that's a good thing. It makes people think harder. And it will open a big conversation, And then if necessary, then, the rat bags like us, lawyers will go and seek to have it, argue it before a court and have it strengthened or not there, depending on our assessment of the situation.
I think for me this goes to the heart of the question of connection as well. So if you've got one piece of legislation that sets out a new way of doing things, but it's not picked up in Planning and Environment Act, or it's not picked up in the planning scheme, then that is a disconnection, and that sadly requires further lobbying of government to address that. But once you've got your first kind of foot in the door with the new legislation, it gives you the space to say, well, I need to see this reflected, because currently there's a barrier to its implementation, and that's because it's not being picked up in the planning scheme, or it's not being utilised by planning decision makers. So I think this is, again, trying to speak carefully about this, but it's something that I've put a lot of thought into in the context of the Birrarung legislation. And around the world, like, this is a major problem for rivers being recognised as living entities because it's not connected to water law, which is vanishingly stupid. Like, it's weird that there's no interrelationship between we're going to recognise this river holistically, but also we're not actually going to change any of the way that we think about or manage water, and they'll just sit there as two completely different pieces of legislation. So I think sometimes government is not great at joining the dots, but when we get something in law, and it's really important that, particularly when we're talking about transformative but symbolic changes like living entity, it has to be in law. It has to have a statutory basis. Otherwise, it's just lip service. But if you can get that into law, and then you've got a platform to keep advocating for that to then be integrated and picked up in all of those connecting pieces of legislation and other decision-making frameworks. So unfortunately, the answer is, yay, keep advocating. But it is the foundation on which you can build.
So I should pick up your point about the Marine and Coastal Act too, Dave. I think that I think the point Erin makes is that it goes to the high degree of fragmentation of the law in managing land and natural resources, very highly fragmented. If you were to, partly perhaps the value of amending the Act, the Water Act, so that a waterway is a living entity, at least generally speaking, is that it kind of goes to, it is quite foundational. The extent to which, and it would then adopt the same definition in other laws by the way in which those laws are drafted, so it would be picked up in planning law and Aboriginal heritage law. I think it's completely unknown whether it would be picked up in the Marine and Coastal Act though. So the question is whether a waterway extends to places that are also fall under the Marine and Coastal Act, which may be the case in relation to estuarine systems, for example. But in part, there's an ambiguity around the living entity status if you incorporate it in water law as to whether it would actually apply in the Marine and Coastal Act. It would be better in some ways that we begin to do, using this approach, we just begin to generalise the proposition of living entity status. So it eventually gets picked up in other like laws. For example, the FFG Act and the application of, or the management of threatened species is an interesting comparison too, right? In Aboriginal law, a lot of threatened species or a lot of ordinate non-threatened species are totemic, or they have, they're vested with effectively are living entities or ancestral species, which is very analogous to like talking about waterways as living entities. But again, the FFG Act, for example, does not pick up the idea of species or animal, flora and fauna being living entities either. You can yell.
Neil from the Gardens Creek Yonku collaboration. Obviously we deal with our own catchment, and we've had the pleasure of having Erin talk to us about living entity, which has been amazing. But I just wanted to clarify with your definition, does that extend to stormwater inputs, and how should we consider that as part of this definition?
Stormwater. Do you want to have a go? Oh, thanks. Stormwater. I mean, I guess the question is obviously the reports. If in terms of the ecological question, like a waterway being a water-dependent ecosystem, leaving aside living entity question for a minute, I think the stormwater one's an interesting example. I think it would really go to the proposition of stormwater assets having ecological values. And increasingly that's often the case. It's comparable, it's about artificial or human-made assets or constructions having significant ecological value really, which is entirely possible and probable and actually does occur. Another example around that are things like drainage channels, agricultural drains, right? frequently. There was I remember back about 10 years ago, there was a big controversy down around Cooey Rup, where they wanted to clear drains. There'd been a lot of flooding, and they couldn't because there was they'd become threatened species corridors for southern brown bandicoot, basically, right? So they have ecological values, because nature has its own way of going, I'm just going to take it back. So that value, those values in themselves should be recognised in terms of waterways. So to the extent that stormwater assets effectively become wetlands, or in other ways have ecological function, then they should be considered waterways. And presently that's not the case. Mostly not the case. As to whether you then take the step of somehow identifying them with a living entity status, again, I think that may be much more dependent on the circumstances than trying to deal with it at a high level. You can foresee a situation in the Yarra, for example, where there's, stormwater or drainage services schemes that have an integral function now in how the river functions, how it functions as a living entity. And then that should be recognised or adopted, I think, to a degree. So I think it shouldn't be ruled out. I think it would have to be dealt with more on a case-by-case basis.
My question is a little bit related to that one. I'm Nicole from the Melbourne River and Waterways Association. And it's just around the work that Southern Rural Water do in licensing dams on waterways. Sometimes it's quite difficult to define if it is a waterway or not. Once a dam is in place and it's on a waterway, and Southern Rural Water considers decommissioning that dam, but it has since become an ecological water-dependent system, how do you proceed from there?
I think for me that goes to the heart of the question of how we make decisions about waterways. And I think one of the challenges in this space, and I think this touches on the stormwater question as well, is that there are always trade-offs. So the framing that I have learnt from Wanganui Iwi, the people of the Wanganui River, is to think about that trade-off question in two ways. One is to think about what does giving first look like? If we think about centering reciprocity with the river, what are we giving to the river in this decision space? And then the second question is abundance. So how do we define abundance for all of us and the river, and what does that look like? So in that sense, it's less about saying here's a trade-off between outcomes and more a way of saying how do we optimise outcomes within this space, which is not just a semantic change. Like, that is actually a foundational way of saying we all need to benefit, including the river. So those kinds of questions of, we've got a circumstance which is causing harm, but now is also a source of benefit. And I think an abundance framing helps us work through that, because then it enables us to really see those benefits to the river and the costs to it, but it enables us to have a holistic way of saying what holistically is the health of this living entity right now, and what would a change result in? Would it increase abundance? Would it help the river thrive? Or would it be taking away something really important? I think one of the dangers in this space is that we think of waterways as pristine, pre-human, without modification as an ideal outcome. And here in Victoria, as throughout Australia, waterscapes are cultural landscapes. So they have been co-created by people for tens of thousands of years. So these are not places that have ever really, in our living memory of place, existed without a human companion and without human agency shaping the way that they operate. So internalising that for me has enabled me to think about those kinds of interventions from the perspective of, well, maybe there's not a clear right and wrong, and that's okay. Like, sometimes we'll keep the dam. as long as there's a real understanding of why that is achieving abundance for a healthy, thriving, living river. But again, it's a shift in focus.
So I think this also goes to a question that I raised earlier, which I think the living entity question raises, or places front and centre, but in a kind of implied way, and that goes to restoration and the whole temporal dimension of managing ecosystems, and including rivers, waterways, and what principles you put around that exercise. And I think it's in our legal tradition, in environmental legal tradition, the question of ecological restoration or recovery are very underdone propositions. Frequently it seems to turn, or at least it appears in common thinking to turn on, we have to go back to something that was pre-existing. But I don't think that is actually how a lot of restoration thinking works in practice, and there's a lot of restoration science that deals with this kind of question, and it doesn't actually deal with that, take that approach. We're not trying to get back necessarily to the starting point. Maybe in some circumstances you are, but at least you have to at least have a reference model, a reference base on which to proceed. And if you're going to kind of call something a living entity, then you have to have a reference of what life is. What does life mean for the living entity? What is the reference model, right? And this is where there is an important intersection, which I think, it needs to be thought through a lot more within government and by lawyers, I think, as well as policymakers and scientists around the recovery and restoration or rehabilitation question. Because it is about where we're going and what principles and, as Erin says, trade-offs in some respects you put around that. In fact, the Development Victoria case was a really interesting example in precisely this issue, because you had a dam that was an ecosystem including for threatened species. It had just been built in the 1940s and it wasn't actually on the waterway. Or so the tribunal found, and I think the tribunal's decision was sound. And then the idea was, we'll simply get rid of that in its entirety and we'll just build a new one, right? Like just add water and you'll get a new one, which I think is not a real... That is actually impugns restoration ecology thinking, in my view. That was not the better way to proceed here. And you were going to... If we take that particular renaturalised dam as having some life of its own, living character, you're going to destroy it, and then you're going to try and rebuild something in its place, the success of which is completely unknown. A lot of contingencies.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Erin. That was an amazing... We really appreciate the presentation. The presentation will be available online if you want to share it with people who have not been able to manage to make it today. When's that going to go up, Cam? Estimate? A week?
Yep.
So please do share it. The report itself will go up. The digital copy...
20 minutes.
Imminently.
Please again do share that. I did want to draw your attention just to our first report that the CWA did, which in some ways was going to try and consider that question about what the boundaries might be of a living entity in terms of looking at widths of riparian corridors for different purposes, and to alert you to the fact that we do have a further report coming out. Dr. Stephen Rowley is writing a report on the living entity in planning controls, starting with the Yarra, Waterways at West and the Barwon. So do look forward to that, please. And I think that is all. Thank you very, very much for coming. Really appreciated it. We've had a pretty full house, so that's been very pleasing to all of us concerned with Waterways Alliance. So we do thank you for coming along. Thanks very much.